So yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to the first session of the Phoenix, Reconfiguring Nature, a seminar by Michael Marder. I'm gonna read the description now. For millennia now, humanity has been implicitly conceiving of nature as a phoenix, understanding its cyclical regeneration as a sign of its infinite capacity for rebirth from the ashes of its destruction. Hoping that such a dynamic would continue indefinitely, we keep literally burning the world down while awaiting its phoenix-like resurgence. Both individually and in groups, as consumers and corporations, states and energy companies, we continue to think and act as if nature were immune to irreparable devastation, as if it, and we ourselves, were a miraculously resilient phoenix. Nevertheless, what is being annihilated today can no longer regerminate and be rejuvenated from ashes, receiving a new lease of life from death as a result of soil degradation and depletion, desertification, and expansion of hypoxic areas in the oceans, the catastrophic melting of Arctic ice, and suffocating smog filling the atmosphere. In the seminar, we delve into the ensuing rift, seeking a philosophy of nature for the 21st century in the contradictions, inconsistencies, asynchronies, and deadlocks of our shared predicament. Our work begins with a thorough questioning of the possibility and obstacles in the path of formulating a philosophy of nature in the 21st century. We will go through a critical exposition of the myth of the phoenix in relation to nature, from ancient Egypt and other parts of North Africa to Greece and Rome. Subsequently, we will examine ancient Greek thinking of nature physics and German Naturphilosophie through the theoretical lens formed and informed by the figure of the phoenix. Finally, we will examine a selection from key traditions in Hinduism, Confucianism, and Russian Cosmism in the same light, paying close attention to variations on the figure of the phoenix, replete with theories of immortality, reincarnation, and liberation from cycles of rebirth. Sounds amazing. Our instructor, Michael Marder, holds an MA in political philosophy granted by the University of York and a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research. He currently is the Iker Basque Research Professor of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country, Vitoria-Gasteiz. He has published and edited dozens of books exploring the phenomenological tradition of continental philosophy and its points of contact with environmental thought and political philosophy. Yeah, please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexander, for this introduction of the course and of myself. It's a pleasure to be joining the new center once again as an instructor for this semester, after a very good experience that I had with a mini seminar last year. And I think some of the participants here are returning from that previous mini seminar. The introduction to the course itself has been already quite thorough, but I will probably say just a few things about the structure of our sessions and of the course itself, and then we will move on to the introduction of participants or self-introductions. So as you know, there are 8 sessions, including this initial one today. And today we will mostly be talking about the very possibility of thinking through and devising a philosophy of nature in the 21st century, and all the barriers that have been created to the very use of the notion of nature, which I want to rescue in a certain sense from contemporary dogma and intellectual fashions. Then in the second session and into the third session, I will be introducing the core ideas of what I'm calling the Phoenix complex, mostly through the mythological frameworks derived from North African, Greek, and Roman traditions. And we will see that there is actually not a single myth of the Phoenix, but a huge variety of such myths, and that the very contradictions and inconsistencies between them are already suggestive of something that is going on here. Then in the third session, we will move into what I'm calling philosophy's third path, mostly with an examination of the works of Plato, and especially the symposium and the sections that I highlighted for you in the syllabus are the ones that I'm asking you to read for sure in preparation for that session, because this is the section which contains Diotimus' speech as related by Socrates. And in Diotimus' speech, I detect kind of the phoenix complex in its miniature but very potent version that will be important for us throughout the rest of our discussions. Then we will move in the fourth session to a consideration of the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, mostly in juxtaposition and comparison with Plato and what he has to say about the notion of immortality, regeneration, generational relations, and so on. And from there, we will move outside of the Western fold to Hindu traditions in the fifth session with a very close analysis of parts of Bhagavad Gita and some Vedic hymns as well. And in the sixth session, we will talk about the notion of generativity and generationality in Confucianism, both the classical and the neo-Confucian varieties, but I'm only asking you to read the Analects by Confucius for that session. And in the seventh session, as it is planned now, we will be moving to the idea of universal resurrection and immortality in Russian cosmism, mostly considering the works of 19th century, late 19th century philosopher Nikolai Fyodorov, and then the early 20th century philosopher or poet, thinker, activist Alexander Svyatogor. In connection with the set of ideas that we're discussing under the overall heading of the Phoenix Complex. And finally, we will conclude with this eighth session, Ashes to Ashes, what needs to be done in order to overcome the Phoenix Complex, always from within, by moving through it, intensifying its contradictions, and hopefully emerging on the hither side beyond this Phoenix complex. So this is the overall structure, the architectonics of our seminar. Of course, it very much depends on the pace with which we're moving through our discussions, because we might linger a little bit longer than planned, especially on this session 5 and session 6, the death, rebirth, and beyond in Hindu traditions, generativity and generationality in Confucianism. The traditions themselves are so rich that it will be impossible, most likely, to confine our discussions to only one session. So there will likely be a spillover into the following ones, but that is fine because session 8, which contains the kind of overall conclusion to our seminar, already is set up in such a way as to accommodate the spillover from the preceding sessions. So this is the overall structure of the course. In each of our sessions of 2.5 hours, we will have a mix of kind of lecturing and discussion, and probably a 5 to 10 minute break in the middle, just to catch our breaths, have some coffee, tea, and so on at the halfway mark of the session. If there are any questions about any of the practical aspects of the course, please feel free to raise them now. Either the practical aspects or even the subject matter as presented. And by the way, I will know those of you who know me, I always welcome participation. So as I mentioned, the sessions are a mix of lecturing and discussion, but if something is unclear or you want a certain point that is raised in the lecture itself to be deepened, please feel free to interject, and we will try to make the sessions as interactive as possible, which is always a little difficult with the Zoom seminars. It is easier with the in-person seminars when you can read the other person's body language and so on, but we will do our best to follow these sorts of more interactive dynamics throughout. If there are no questions at this point, please let's continue with the introductions of participants. Yes.
Sorry. I want to know about the presentation. So we have to present every class as we do, and when it's going to be.
Yes, Rodolfo. Yes, thank you for this question. So I assume that this procedure is more or less standard in all the New Center seminars. So there is a list of topics with the possible slots for presentations, and Alexander is keeping track of that. So it will be important after the session for you to contact him in order to put your name down for one of these slots. And of course, today there are no presentations, but they already begin next week for session 2, mostly on the writings of Lactantius, Claudius Claudian, and Ovid. Right, so you can choose the topic or the author that you are really interested in and sign up for that slot of the presentation.
Just for a quick, I just put the spreadsheet in the chat. Let me know if there's something missing there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Alexander. So any other questions, or if not, we can continue with the presentations.
Just a little quick reminder also, it's really important for the students to try and engage in groups in the presentations. The New Center is trying to enforce that. So just to keep that in mind, up until 4 people, but 3 people, it's the best, I guess, for the students to try and engage and talk about the texts.
Yes, definitely. Those group projects or group presentations, in my experience, have been extremely successful, at least in the last seminar that I taught for the New Center. They have been very successful. And the same goes for final projects, by the way. So you are free to do a final project that is a group project. And I always encourage a very creative component to the final project. So it can be a work of art in any medium you choose. It can be a film, painting, whatever it is, on the topic of the seminar. And then attached to that work of art, there should be roughly a 5-page description or explanation, interpretation of the work of art in light of the topics that we covered in our seminar. And these final projects that have an artistic component, they can be, once again, they can be individual, they can be group projects. You are free to choose that. Right. So if there are no other questions, we can continue with the presentations. Maybe Rodolfo, since you spoke, you appear next in the sequence of people on my screen, so you can.
Okay. Well, hello, it's so nice to see you again. It was an amazing seminar, the one of the starting with plants. My name is Rodolfo. I'm from Mexico, and mostly I work as a visual artist with erosion of the image and production of images through erosion, piracy, and gossip. And also I'm recently a teacher of visual arts, and I work a lot with secretions of plants to make pigments and binders. So still it is very interesting to me, this material turn that appears every time in these kind of seminars. So that's all. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Rodolfo. Please, maybe we'll go through the sequence as it appears on my screen here. So next we have Bridget Maggie, right? Bridget.
Hi. Sorry if my voice sounds a bit croaky. It's 2 a.m. here. I'm from New Zealand. I recently completed my BA in art history, and I've just done some independent study of continental theory and psychoanalysis. So I'm kind of just hoping to build on those like methodologies with this course. So it's my first course through the new center. I'm excited to start it. So yeah, nice to meet everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bridget, for the introduction. And of course, I will add to this that, yes, you can say that there is a kind of continental philosophy methodology involved in the course, but also an attempt at doing comparative philosophy, precisely because I'm dealing and trying to deal really in depth with the Hindu and Confucian traditions, and also Russian cosmism that is a little bit outside the fold within, but also outside European thought. So yeah, that's the supplement to the continental perspective, let's say. Yes.
Right, that sounds like it'll be really helpful.
Definitely. Thank you. Next, we have Emil Wilmer, right? We can't hear you, Emil, sorry. There is sound, but it's very, very low, a little bit inaudible.
Can you hear me now?
A little better now, yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Neil. I've done 2 seminars with New Center. Most of the background is very interested in Marx.
I'm sorry, I can't really tell what you're saying. There's some technical problem with the sound. Maybe we'll come back to you, Emil. So while you try to figure out what's wrong with the mic or something like that, and just continue with the self-presentations of participants. So we have Vitor Melo next in the sequence here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vitor, a clinical psychologist and writer from Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in how poetic language and literature in general can give us insight on human mind and deepen our knowledge about it, or maybe creating new forms of mind or understanding how the human can work and be expanded. So it's basically it. Hello.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Vitor. And of course, you are also in the right place, because we will be dealing quite a bit with traditions that are deemed literary traditions, even though there is a very strong philosophical and maybe, yes, you could say psychological component to them as well. So definitely, welcome. Next, Katerina Volochnuk.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Katerina. I'm an art historian from Kiev, Ukraine, but now I live in Scotland. So my main working fields are history of photography and memory studies. And I enrolled on this seminar because the idea of Phoenix was always quite fascinating for me, but at the same time, my main research now, it is based on the Soviet photography, on the processes of industrialization. And I think the idea of Phoenix is quite related to this, because Soviet culture with all these mausoleums, it kind of revolves around this ideas of immortality and resurrection. So I would definitely love to incorporate this background to my research.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Katerina. You're absolutely right that there is quite a bit of relevance here, and you mentioned mausoleums. Of course, we'll see that the Phoenix arises as a mythical figure, not even in ancient Greece, but actually in ancient Egypt, right? With all of its pyramidal kind of aspiration to eternity. But we will also have a chance to see a very clear difference between immortality and eternity on the one hand, and the kind of perpetual regeneration, rebirth from death on the other hand. So this will be one of the important points that we'll be raising in the seminar, the difference between immortal, eternal being on the one hand, the ideal of metaphysics, let's say, and on the other hand, accepting finitude and death, but also then having a kind of an assured hope of resurrection and regeneration from that. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Next in the list, let's see, Jonathan Hosfarani. Jonathan?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been to the News Center a while. I guess my interest is sort of political ecology and sort of the Anthropocene and climate change and that sort of stuff. So it works quite well. I'm quite familiar with your work, Michael. And I specifically sort of focus on sort of capitalism and colonialism and this issue of waste and inequality in particular. So yeah, I'm just based outside of Canada, but originally from the UK. So I thought I'd mention that.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Next, we have here in the list Mstislav Kazakov. Yes?
Yes. Hello, my name is Mstislav. I'm from Kiev, originally from Ukraine. Now I reside in Funchal, in Portugal, at Madeira. I'm PhD in philosophy, lecturer in Kiev Polytechnical University. My main scientific interests, research interests are metaphysics of time and philosophies of pessimism. And my final project for the new center is the idea of diachronic critique of reason, which is based on theory fiction framework of William Hope Hodgson's Nightland, which deals with the problem of ecological landscapes and with the problem of humans who have tried to reconfigure nature but have failed to do so. So I suppose your seminar will give me much more knowledge to accomplish it. And the second reason, auxiliary, is the personal one, your book, Philosophy for Passengers, because I'm the person which hates traveling, hates being passenger, and this experience of moving from the edge of prehistory to the middle of nowhere, where I now reside, was traumatic. And then I have bought your book, and this helped me to recapitulate my traumatic experience in some sense.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Mstislav. Actually, one thing I want to pick up from your introduction is the philosophies of pessimism and the issue of hopelessness. It is something that we'll be talking a lot about, perhaps even today, but in the next session as well, for sure. And especially the idea of how it is possible to gain a new hope out of the depths of despair and hopelessness, and how Yes, and how hope can actually be a very destructive and conservative force that keeps things the status quo as it is. So this is something that we'll definitely touch upon. And it's crucial, really, to the course, this topic. So thank you for the introduction. Next in the list here, I have Maria Jesus Mauri, or Mori. Did I say your name correctly, Maria?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can't see you, but we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, I can't show my camera right now. I'm moving kind of a lot, but hopefully that won't make that much of noise. So yeah, Maria Jesus Mauri is a French last name, I think, so I don't know how to pronounce that. But I'm a composer and researcher, I think, and the arts leader. I think that's a translation of Cuestión Cultural in Spanish from English to English. And my main focuses are resonance, communities, the build of communities, sustenance of communities, and I think that's it. I'm sorry, it's 8 a.m. and I'm not that well aware of things. Yes, but I really was I'm really interested in the topic of this seminar. I come from another seminar from Stephanie Wakefield, and that was about the Anthropocene design. I was very based upon her idea of the back loop, and I've been sort of thinking a lot of stuff around what are the Latin American responses in experimental arts around these topics, and how we are already doomed, but at the same time, that has been always the condition for, let's put unquote, quote unquote, third world communities to be always doomed. So I'm really interested to tackle this idea of the phoenix, of the continuous cycles of renewal that we can be always skeptical of, and try to apply it to this very general topic of resonance and relation and feedback, which is like very tied up with my sound work, I would say. So yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting suggestion also, that they're beyond the very spectacular visual image presented by the Phoenix, at least in the dominant version of the myth of the Phoenix. As we'll see, there are other versions that are almost unknown, but that are much more, quite different from the bird that burns up to ashes and then regenerates from those ashes immediately. But it's an interesting suggestion to also focus on sound and resonance in relation to ecology. I have not done it so much in this work on related to the Phoenix, but perhaps you know the work on Saint Hildegard of Bingen, Green Mass, which was my collaboration also with a contemporary Swedish composer, Peter Schuback, who wrote a musical composition resonating with this work of philosophy, theology, literature. But resonance in and of itself is one of the chapters, an important chapter in that book, precisely because I think that Hildegard, not so much the stories of the Phoenix, but Hildegard calls upon us to understand ecology through auditory signals, not so much in visual terms, not through images, but through sounds, right? As a co-sounding, as a symphony of being. So there, I can, when you say the word resonance, that always brings me back to that particular thinker. And actually, if we were to have more time, I know 8 sessions is already a lot, but if we were to have more time, we could say quite a few things about Hildegard's notion or implicit notion of the Phoenix in her idea of viriditas. So yeah, just a small hint there about resonances. And thank you, Maria, for the introduction. Next, there is Zlata Mechetina. Zlata, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Zlata. I'm London-based art director and curator. I'm currently graduating from like CSM, performance practice and design, but I have a background in art history. My focus is media archaeology, post-internet, video making. So yeah, I don't know, I'm just like excited to hear Eric's ideas, and it sounds like we have like such a fun mix of like different spheres. So I don't know, I'm really excited to see how it will go. But personally speaking, I think I would just like really want to become more literate with philosophy, because for now my background is more like speculative realism, some Negrestani, Bratton, and like Deleuze. But I'd rather have like a bit more of an insight of what was happening like in between them.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Zlata. And of course, we will go, and this is usually my approach, go to the very deep roots, philosophical, ideological, ideational roots of contemporary realities. And this is an important feature of the seminar throughout. So I think that will probably satisfy this idea of broadening the horizon of philosophical inquiry into the present. Yes. Thank you, Zlata. And Emil, let's see, Emil Vilmar, if your sound is working now, so that we can.
Any luck?
Yes. Now I think it's working.
Okay, perfect. I think it was my internet. So,
yes.
This is my first seminar with the new center. I've done it with about 3 others. I was watching Thinking Through Plants on the audit, and I was
you know, it's still it's a little better, Emil, but still I'm having trouble hearing you clearly. I don't know why.
Maybe it's my
maybe it's the microphone, or if you could maybe speak close to the microphone, or you can write about yourself as well. Yeah, definitely. So let's see, have I missed anyone on the list? I know Ishita and Nima have already introduced themselves, so we won't make them repeat what they said. Is there anyone who hasn't introduced themselves yet? No, I think so. Everyone And it's really great, once again, to be with a group of people with such diverse interests, both theoretical and artistic. It's really a strong point of the new center that it attracts participants like yourselves. And so it's a pleasure to share with you some of my most recent research on what I'm calling the Phoenix complex. But as I mentioned, for today's session, I wanted us to think a little bit about the very idea of a philosophy of nature, of this term nature, and what it means, if it means anything still today, what it can mean today. And for this, I'm asking you to leave the preconceived ideas, prejudices aside, because by now, after all of these decades of deconstructing nature, of criticizing it from all kinds of points of view, from the colonial to the feminist and so on, we cannot help but associate something very negative and very limited with it. It is one of those words that has accrued a certain prejudice, word, but also a concept that has accrued a certain prejudice that I want to dispense with, and to see the very idea of nature afresh, anew, in order for us to continue thinking with and through it. And of course, the notion of nature is not the only one that has suffered this kind of denigration. I would add also the idea of essence and the idea of truth. So if you take these three words or concepts, essence, truth, and nature, then we can safely say that these three concepts have been really highly suspect, to the point of being tabooed in continental philosophy circles and probably in the art circles as well now, since at least the second half of the 20th century. And nature is by far the most prominent of the three, because it's like the foundation for this whole edifice, particularly because it touches upon essence and truth alike. So essence may be understood as the inner nature of things, while truth is defined, at least in some accounts, as the accordance of a statement with their outer nature, or in a word, with reality, right? So we have the nature, essence as the inner truth of things, and truth as the correspondence of the outer nature of things and a statement. And so a lot rides on the undercutting of nature. A lot rides on the undercutting of nature, whether in its inner or in its outer aspects. When it erodes, its companion terms promptly follow suit, right? And so we, as I already mentioned, we reject this concept for a slew of reasons, including its atavistic connotations, hierarchical presuppositions, blindness to cultural and historical constructions, and so forth. And then, having rejected nature without really understanding what it stands for or what it means, we proudly declare our membership in the vanguard of contemporary criticism, liberated from the symbolic yoke of the past, which we would rather forget. And then we get non-essentialism and post-truth as the badges of honor that go along with this membership in the vanguard of contemporary criticism. Now, the thesis that nature does not exist has found adherents of every stripe. The 19th century distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, between natural and human sciences, which had served as the cornerstone of the modern university system, has imploded, rendering both terms in the contrast meaningless, right? So both natural and human sciences and the notion of Geist, of spirit at the heart of the human sciences or the humanities, and the notion of nature at the heart of natural sciences have been rendered meaningless. Roughly at the same time that the spirit, or the Geist, at the pinnacle of the humanities lost its credibility, the nature, or Natur, at the base of the hard sciences has been divested of its significance. At the hands of natural scientists, nature dissolves into organic and inorganic, chemical and molecular components, quantum mechanics and wave oscillations, condensed matter and thermodynamic processes. And in the context of such a dissolution, a unified notion of nature sounds like a specious abstraction, right? So even at the heart, at the hands of the scientists, of natural scientists, nature no longer makes sense because everything is dissolved into these kinds of processes, micro components, and so on. And along with nature, life as well becomes an outdated concept. So when we throw nature out of the window, life itself becomes an outdated concept after it has been reduced by the scientists to protein structures or energy and signal transduction, to enzyme catalysts and metabolic pathways, to genes and their expressions, right? All of this happens in tandem, just as nature as a unified concept makes no sense, even from the standpoint of natural scientists. So life itself reduced to these molecular or energy or other components loses sense also. Having fallen victim to these and countless other reductions, the life of life sciences turns out to be all but dead. And furthermore, the connection between life and nature should not be viewed as a connection between an organic part and the whole that is made of organic as well as inorganic components. So what we understand by life in connection to nature is again something very reductionist, something very reduced. We think that nature, or insofar as it still makes sense, overall is largely inorganic, and organic life is a small part of it, right? At its Latin etymological root, natura derives from the verb nascere, and I'll write these out. Sorry, this was corrected by the natura, is derived from the Latin verb nascere, which means to be born, and specifically of the passive part of this word to be born, nato, right? Nato, which is the past participle of nascere. Nature then is natality, the movement of birthing, of a beginning of life that keeps re-beginning and that perpetually in stato nascendi, perpetually in a state of being born, which does not at all exclude death and dying, keeps giving rise to future life out of the remnants of the past, of rivers and mountains, plants and animals, stones and humans, and of course, bacteria and an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. So in this broader sense that I want us to start with, not the reduced preconceived notion of nature, but going back to at least its Latin root, nature is not a conjunction of mostly dead materials somehow put together by the human mind. It is a movement. Nature is a movement, the dance of first coming to appearance, hatching or germinating, emerging from the birth canal or undergoing fission. It is a dance of coming to appearance, of that which comes to an appearance as an effect, of that from which the appearing comes, and of that wherein that which appears emerges. So nature is as a mix of this modes of birthing, is a complex dance of coming to appearance, that from which, or the one from whom something comes to appearance, the one who comes to appearance, and that within which the coming to appearance happens. Coming to appearance, for its part, is not covered by either the classical or the modern types of causality, right? As a result, it is not merely phenomenal, but phenomenalizing, right? So it is not only that which appears, but the very making possible of that which appears as a self-phenomenalizing movement. And as such, it both precedes and succeeds scientific explanations, right? This is precisely what phenomenology deals with, not so much the phenomena as the appearances, but the modes of coming to appearance. And I'm suggesting here in these very preliminary remarks that nature understood as the movement of birthing is a coming to appearance in all of these different ways. A coming to appearance which is never, of course, final, which always recedes back into the obscurity from which it emerges, which is why I'm saying that it does not at all exclude death and mortality as well, right? And so we have the, on the one hand, the tragic state of the global environment now in the 21st century with the objective devastation of nature, which threatens beyond any given species the ostensibly inexhaustible stream of birthing indicated by the word itself. And then we have, on the other hand, and as a corollary, the subjective and epistemic destruction of nature as a category. And we can take beyond the way that nature is destroyed at the hands of the natural scientists themselves. We can take some recent paradigmatic examples as well. But before we do so, any observations, comments? Once again, as I said, our sessions are a mix of lecturing and discussion, and I'm always very interested in your feedback, in points that sound suggestive to you, that you want to be deepened. I will occasionally open the floor for these points more formally like now, but as I mentioned, you should also feel free to jump in and interject if you want to add something to what is being said as well. So to recap, I was only talking about the way that nature is dismissed out of hand as a useless category nowadays, how it is being destroyed both epistemically and ontologically. And if we merely look at the etymology of the word in English, which derives from Latin, and by the way, this Latin etymology is not the absolute origin, of course, because we can go further back into the Greek, physis, which, by the way, we discussed in the previous seminar. The question is, what at all can we do with the notion of nature today, and what this notion can still do to us, to our thinking, if we understand it in relation to birth and birthing, to being born, and to coming to appearance, and then to receding to the obscurity from which we came. And by we, I mean not only the human we, but everything that lives and can be born, right? And I mentioned also, by the way, that nature should not be understood as a largely inorganic kind of composite with a few organic materials within it. But if we go back to ancient modes of thinking nature, both in the East and in the West, then we understand that nature, natura, physis, is the overall movement of birthing of everything that is. So even things that we consider to be inorganic, like mountain ranges, can be understood as something that is born thanks to the activity of the earth itself. The volcanic activity, for instance, right, that allows these mountain ranges to emerge, that reshapes the very landscape and creates various ecosystems. So when we think about geology, for instance, here, or metals, the germination of metals in the ores where they are found, again, we should come in touch with an ancient and maybe alien to us perspective, which shows that metals are almost plant-like. They're growing, maturing in their ores, just on a very slow time scale. And therefore, there is no reason to exclude them from the movement, overall movement of birthing or growing, as physis will convey, of all that is gathered under the heading of nature, right? One of the last traces of this kind of thinking, at least in Western philosophy, was German Romanticism, and specifically the thinking of Novalis, right, who goes back to this ancient tradition, but also through the mediation of alchemy, right? Alchemy runs through as a kind of vein, of epistemic vein that connects more contemporary modes of thinking with the ancient traditions of reconceiving nature and even apparently inorganic materials as living, as being born, as finite and dying as well, right? So please, any comments, feedback on this before we continue?
I was wondering, as I was listening to the idea of nature as a movement, and this not just any kind of movement, but also almost dance-like movement, what you put it down as, right? And I was wondering what you thought about myths as site where these movements have appeared in kind of an epic way, right? Because even as you took us back to natura and nascer in the Latin, and I was thinking of how within the Hindu traditions, nature, one of the ways to refer to it is also prakriti, but it's also a highly gendered way, and nature in that sense appears in a feminine manner, and then manifests in multiple forms. And each of those forms within them carries very different kinds of movement and intensities and ways of being born. So I was just curious what you thought of myths as a site, where this re-enchantment of nature can happen.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Ishita, for your question. And you can tell even by the title of the seminar that myths as such a site are extremely important to me. This is why we're talking about the Phoenix complex here, because I think that myths allow us to think symptomatically, as it were, right? So in my reading of myths is a kind of symptomatic reading. This is, of course, not a term that I invent. I borrow it from Louis Althusser, a 20th century French Marxist thinker who developed what he called the symptomatic reading of Marx's Capital, which is precisely a reading, or you could say a reading between the lines, reading a text not specifically for what it says explicitly, but for all the lacunae, the silences, the exclusions within it, right? And this is the approach to the reading of myths that I adopt, a kind of symptomatic reading, because I think that if we think about, say, Adorno and Horkheimer and their dialectic of enlightenment, of course, they point out that myth is already enlightenment in dialectical terms, right? It's an enlightenment that perhaps is still unaware of itself as such. I would say, well, I agree with the basis of the argument, but I would say the exact opposite. What has been called the European Enlightenment is a kind of myth that is unaware of itself as such, the myth of pure reason detached from everything that it has repressed, from animality to emotion to femininity and all the other things that are repressed in the cold light of European Enlightenment. So yes, you are putting your finger, Ishita, on a very important point here, the epistemology of myths as giving us a unique point of access to this material at hand, and the fact that these mythologies are not just collections gathered somewhere in classical texts, they are the mythologies that keep working in our minds, mostly at the unconscious level, and I think Vitor will tell us a lot about this, Vitor Melo, who is a psychologist, right? And so the symptomatic or symptomal reading is also a kind of psychoanalytic reading, you could say, right? A reading for the unconscious influences of what consciously appears, what consciously presents itself. And we will see very shortly that what I'm calling a Phoenix complex is a largely unconscious complex that we harbor both individually and collectively, and that determines in different ways our relations to ourselves, our relation to the outside nature, and our relation to such concepts as energy and many other things as well. Yes, so we will have a chance. I see that Vitor says that that's exactly what he's interested in, and we'll have a chance to consider also the complex nature of the Phoenix complex by linking it to the Oedipal complex, of course, and Freud and all of the different complexes that Freud talks about, but also going back to the fire complexes, specifically in Gaston Bachelard. Because as we'll see, my point of departure in thinking about the Phoenix complex is as an addition to the two fire complexes that Gaston Bachelard identifies in his psychoanalysis of fire, namely the Prometheus complex and the Empedocles complex, right? So, this is the idea here. But also another important point that you're raising, Ishita, is of course the gendering of nature in the feminine. If we are talking about the movement of birthing, of course, the idea is that the birthing always comes from a mother, from a maternal mother, and this mother can be a human mother, an animal, but it can be also a kind of a mother earth from which plants also emerge, because their birth is a germination and sprouting and coming to appearance in this other way. By the way, this is an important point to keep in mind. When we talk about birthing, we have a kind of animalist prejudice in our heads, right? Now, it's not only the figure of the mother that lurks behind the scenes, but also a birth is something that describes the emergence of the world of an animal. And of course, plants, one could say, are born, but they are born differently. They germinate, they sprout, and in their movement of birthing, they are not disconnected from the one from whom, or from the one from that to which they are tethered through their roots, right? If an animal or human birth necessarily entails a separation from the maternal udder, a cutting of the umbilical cord, or hatching from an egg, let's say, that is already separate from the maternal udder, then with plants, this movement of birthing maintains a clear continuity with the earth, right? And this point for me has been extremely important, specifically in discussions with Lucy Rigaray, with whom we published together the book Through Vegetal Being in 2016. Lucy's, of course, by now classical idea that the myth of the cave in Plato has to be understood as a literal notion of birthing, a birth, but connected to the human mind and no longer to the body. In our discussions in the run-up to the publication of this book, I mentioned to Luce that the two models for birth, one with the separation from the maternal udder of humans and animals, and the other with plants that are much more continuous and that keep in touch with the obscurity of the earth through their roots, even as they emerge to the light of the sun. And this would entail a different model of knowing and ideation, right? If we have a kind of literal birth applied to the birth of the mind, the birth of ideas in Plato, then a vegetal birth that does not detach itself from the soil, from obscurity, from darkness, and that is nourished by that darkness and death actually at the same time, gives us a very different model of what it means to know, to be in the world, to relate to the world as well, right? So yeah, thank you so much for all of these points. We could talk almost indefinitely about them, but I see that there are some written commentaries as well. One from Emil about a segue into cosmism with allowing for immortality not to be precluded by nature. Yes, so Emil, if you could maybe clarify this a little bit. It is true that well, we'll touch upon this when we deal with the actual theories of Russian cosmism. But of course, it is true that for them, immortality is not precluded by nature. If anything, nature itself becomes self-conscious, comes to a consciousness of itself through this human activity that seeks universal resurrection and universal immortality for all. So it is not an anti-natural movement, but a movement that presumably completes and perfects nature itself, right, according to the cosmist perspective. And this allows us to understand also nature as a historical category, right? As a category that evolves and comes to a consciousness of itself, still maybe in this very classical Hegelian way, but is not a static kind of collection of natural artifacts or natural objects that we tend to associate it with. And then another comment from Jonathan, so we should slow down to the speed of rocks maybe. That's an interesting suggestion. Of course, in my work on plants, I've also advocated for paying very close attention to vegetal temporalities that are radically different from human time consciousness, right? And I want to actually add here that we have to be clear about the difference between the objective temporality of a process, of a physiological process on the one hand, and what in phenomenology is called time consciousness, that is our experience of the passage of time, right? Because even though at the level of our human time consciousness, we cannot register most often, unless we are in a state of deep meditation or a psychedelic state induced by certain plants, most often we cannot register the kinds of subtle movements of growth, decay, and metamorphosis that plants go through because they live in another time zone. They move at another time scale, imperceptible from the standpoint of our human experience. Of course, even more so for rocks and metals and so on, right? But there is a difference between time consciousness on the one hand and the processes, physical and physiological time processes on the other. So even in our bodies, there are certain processes of which we cannot be conscious because the time consciousness of our perception is not adjusted to them most often. The processes of metabolism, for instance. I mean, we can sometimes note if our metabolism has been too fast and we become hungry very easily and so on. But at the cellular level, at the molecular level, obviously we cannot accompany what is going on even within our own bodies. And maybe this kind of limit to our time consciousness in relation to what is going on with our bodily extension itself could be a bridge to our relation to the world of plants and minerals, rocks, and so on, right? So I always emphasize, and I think maybe this point was made in the seminar last year, that aside from the vegetal other who is outside of ourselves, the plants outside, and aside even from the mineral other outside of ourselves, like mountains and rocks and so on, there is a vegetal and mineral other within also, right? There is this otherness within us, within our bodies that are the archives of a long history of the planet, right? From the mineral composition of the skeleton, which is the part that usually in the usual process of decomposition remains afterwards for the longest time, and sometimes ossifies even more and becomes fossilized, right? All of these are traces of inorganic, vegetal, animal existence within ourselves, and we can read our bodies, but also our psyches as archives with different levels and layers of these human and other than human existences, right? Other comments or questions, please? So if not, we can continue just with two very clear cases, contemporary cases of the epistemic destruction of the category of nature. And at least one of them you'll be familiar with for sure. It's my friend Timothy Morton. Oh, Mstislav has his hand raised. I'm sorry, I didn't have everyone on the, yes, now I saw in chat, but since I don't have everyone on screen, let me Let me see if I have, yeah, I put you in the gallery view now so I can see everyone. Please, Mstislav, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment concerning the Phoenix complex. We yet don't know what it is, but I believe I have an impression that it is closely connected to time perception, namely to this distinction between deep time and vital time, or what Negrestani calls vital time. I mean that I have read that geologists, when they have been studied as students, they first thing that which they do learn, they learn to how to perceive the deep time. And Hodgson, in his work of fiction, The Nightland, shows the what I believe to be the a sort of instance of Phoenix complex. There are geologic monstrosities which they call watchers, and they cannot just tell whether they are alive or not, but they for sure know that they are evil, since their speed of movements to besieged archaeology of humans called the last reduct is about 100 meters per 10,000 years. So they are living geological monstrosities, and humans just cannot understand how should they react to it, since they cannot just tell the difference between living and non-living, between rock and form of life. That
yes, that's a good point, Mstislav, and we will see. You say correctly. Also, we still don't know what the Phoenix complex is, and as we'll see, it's impossible to define it in a single sentence or even in a paragraph. That's why it's a complex, right? It's this complexity that gives it a very multifaceted character that needs to be thought through from many different dimensions. But one of them you are identifying quite correctly, because as we will see, the projection of the figure of the Phoenix happens not only with respect to nature, so we think of nature both within ourselves and outside of us as a kind of phoenix, but this projection already in antiquity happens at the level of the cosmos as such. So we can talk about the cosmic phoenix, and that's why the works of Russian cosmism are quite crucial here, but also many other things in ancient Greek philosophy and so on. So the cosmic dimension, of course, goes along the same lines as I mentioned with regard to the notion of nature, that it is not just a collection of mostly inorganic things with a small bit of organic matter, but rather the cosmos, as understood by the ancients, is itself a living whole, nearly immortal, nearly eternal, but not completely, right? So it's understood, as we will see in Plato, for instance, the cosmos is understood as a gigantic animal or a gigantic plant that grows and therefore has the same characteristics as living beings in a miniature. And this, right? And
I like this difference between gods and mortals in Greeks, that this is a matter of degree, but not a fully qualitative degree, just quantitative.
Yes, exactly. So the cosmos is not these vast empty spaces that we think about or that we tend to associate the term with, but it's like natura or like physis. It is a living whole, like a plant, a gigantic plant or animal, made mostly of fire, and we'll have a chance to think about the different elements, and especially fire, and maybe a little bit about the earth in relation to the phoenix, the figure of the phoenix as well. Just running a little bit ahead of ourselves, I would mention that in these global visions of the cosmos as a gigantic living being, there is a certain temporality, cycles of generation and destruction that are also attributed to the cosmos. So aeonic eras of deep time, of cosmic time, are often equated with a lifespan of the phoenix in this sense, right? So the phoenix understood on the cosmic scale. And this is
mistaken, Greeks had two gods of time, Aion and Kronos. Yes. The synchronicity and diachronicity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, exactly. And one rule of thumb that we should all keep in mind throughout the seminar and in all other approaches, specifically to non-modern, ancient, but also non-Western philosophy, is that the macrocosm, such as the cosmos or nature, is always reflected in the microcosm. So the living beings that are plants, animals, or even humans are a miniature, like as a microcosm, are a miniature mirror of the cosmos at large, right? So there is this relation of mirroring between immense realities of nature as a whole or of cosmos on the one hand, and the beings, cosmic beings that populate these realities, right? So this is an important, as I mentioned, rule of thumb for ancient Western traditions outside the West, and within the more contemporary parts of Western thought of mystical traditions, including, of course, the three monotheisms, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So Islamic, Christian, and Jewish mysticisms always lead us back to this insight of the beings that we are, and even plants and the smallest grain of sand being in a miniature, a reflection of the whole of cosmos, right? Yes, so we can continue a little bit along these lines, just still thinking more broadly, more generally about the notion of nature and problematizing its kind of uncritical rejection nowadays. And the two contemporary examples that I wanted to cite very briefly here are Timothy Morton and Lorraine Daston. So you probably know Timothy. Oh, and I see Rodolfo has a question. We'll come back to you, Rodolfo, in a moment, okay? Sorry, yes, sorry that I missed that. You know Timothy's work, which I in many ways admire, but when it comes to nature, and you know that Timothy has this book, Ecology Without Nature, right? And the kind of liberation really of the thinking of ecology without nature as a kind of straitjacket that keeps it down. For Timothy, nature is a transcendental principle which needs to be done and over with for ecology and ecological thought to flourish. And so I'll cite him very briefly. The very idea of nature, which so many hold dear, will have to wither away in an ecological state of human society. Strange as it may sound, the idea of nature is getting in the way of properly ecological forms of culture, philosophy, politics, and art. But my question is, why should we constrain nature to an idea, and one detained in scarce quotes at that, to a transcendental idea specifically? Are birth and birthing that nourish its sense equally amenable to idealization, right? So for all the presumed problems that also accompany the understanding of nature as birth and the movement of birthing, I would claim that this understanding is highly resistant to the movement of idealization, even though much of, let's say, Western philosophy from Plato to Hannah Arendt is invested in this idealizing movement. So for philosophers, at least in the West, the first birth, the first material appearance of a human being in the world is quite unimportant compared to the second birth, what both Plato and Hannah Arendt, actually, of all people as well, call the second birth, a kind of self-given, self-mediated birth, which can happen in different ways. For Plato, when we emerge to the light of ideas and our souls, our minds open up to this eidetic light. For Hannah Arendt, when we engage with others in political praxis, right? So these are two different modes of the second birth, but what they share is precisely this idea of the second birth, which is ideal and idealizing, I would say, compared to the material emergence of our bodies in this world in the so-called first birth. But as such, the concept of birth is not so much a concept as an event, really, which I would say resists idealization despite all of these attempts of Western philosophers. And a similarly unjustified epistemic mutilation of nature is evident in Lorraine Daston's recent book, Against Nature. So the title of the book is Against Nature. And while she admits that, I quote, like all truly interesting words, nature is a millefeuille of meanings, she narrows down its semantic range to order, if not the transcendental, once again, assurance of order. For her, the specific natures guarantee an order of things. And the load-bearing point in the argument converts nature then into a static category, ignoring the dynamic strengths of birthing. But should one insist on this formulation of the problem, nature would be both an order and an ordering, which implies a persistent and disordering of things. It is never a static order given once and for all. It's not the medieval scala naturae, right? The hierarchical order of being that is presented by God and is unchangeable, but rather nature as order. Even if we accept this thesis, nature as order would entail a persistent and disordering of itself, right? And as such, it can guarantee nothing but change, turmoil, and disruption, even if we buy into this idea, right? Rodolfo, maybe we'll go to you now for the question that you had.
Well, maybe somehow it's related, but it's about the place of technique in the idea of separation of the nature and the idea of mother. You know, I was thinking in this link between mother and wood, in mother and madera, and also materia, you know, but
yes.
also this strange link we have in somehow with the idea of this nature we think as something that is somehow linked to this mother of shapes or mother of things that needs to be separated. Maybe it's you know through the, you know, maybe it's something that has to do with it. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very interesting point you're raising there, Rodolfo. And of course, the gendering of nature, of course, touches upon the very complex nexus of concepts that you are talking about, and that I think we also covered in the previous seminar. So this nexus of terms, mother, mater in Latin, materia, matter, mother, matter, and madera or madeira, wood or the woods, right? And there, in Spanish and Portuguese, we have a trace of that initial link between matter and wood, right? In the notion of madera or madeira. But if we go back to the ancient Greek thinking, the very emergence of the category or of the notion of matter in Aristotle's thought was thanks to the term ule in ancient Greek. I will spell it here for you. Ule, which was later translated in Latin into materia, right? And ule in Common Greek means both the woods, so the forests, communities of living plants, and wood as the material, dead material derived from plants. So there is obviously a kind of indeterminacy between life and death already included in this term that gave rise to the notion of matter. But the important point here that Rodolfo is making is that if we keep in mind this complex connection of terms, mother, matter, and wood, then technique would imply a kind of intervention that comes with the separation from the maternal source, right? And would entail the imposition of form through, again, a gendered element of the masculine imposition of form. And in fact, in the separation of techne and physis, of nature and artifice, this kind of gendering has been prevalent, traditionally prevalent, really. But it entails already a very mutilated notion of the relation of matter and form, that form has to be imposed from the outside as the ordering kind of element brought about by the father or by the masculine figure in connection to the maternal source. In Aristotle, this still does not happen. So when Aristotle thinks about the connection of matter and form, he obviously has certain gendered connotations attached to these, but he thinks that everything is largely hylomorphic, so that matter gives its forms to itself. And this is what life is. This is what vegetal life is. This is what all life is. It's the self-forming of matter and the changing, reforming, metamorphoses that these forms undergo necessarily, right? So again, the term is hylomorphism, and it means the primordial unity of yle, matter, and morphe, form, right? So if you don't have a separation between matter and form, then the scheme that Rodolfo has outlined for us so nicely would not work yet, right? So it is a kind of form as a kind of self-given thing that matter gifts itself with, and it's becoming other to itself. It is not something that is imposed from the outside, right? And even, I mean, if we take this gendered kind of discourse to a genetic level and the X and Y chromosomes, right? And the idea that the X chromosome is there as the base, right? So you can have double X or you can have X and Y, right? So we can see that it is not an imposition. It is the Y chromosome is an addition that is actually not an external addition, but a kind of truncation of the X chromosome as well. So, I mean, from molecular genetics to Aristotelian thought, you can see how this much more holistic notion of a relation of matter and form works in that sense, right? And the question, yes, the question of separation at birth and even at death will be an important point for us as we consider the dynamics of the Phoenix complex, thinking about all of those gaps and fissures between existences and modes of existence and periods of lives, both within the life that we consider to be a continuity for each one of us, and between the different lives of generations. We will consider to what extent these are really gaps, to what extent they are continuities, to what extent the flow of a life that seems to be continuous is already punctured by mini deaths and rebirths. All of this will be considered by us and will problematize the very straightforward notions of separation and continuity that, of course, in their pure form, give us a very caricaturized view of what existence is and of what philosophy should aim at. Right. So, but going back to this broader notion of nature linked to birth and birthing, it seems that nature promises an ostensibly limitless outpouring of births, thanks to its ongoing hallmark activity of birthing. And on the other hand, our contemporary philosophical, scientific, and technological outlooks are spellbound by death. I've already mentioned how decrying life as a metaphysical delusion, as atavistic as nature itself, biological sciences study life phenomena in terms of their substantive biochemical or biophysical substratum, rendering them as good as dead. Analytic philosophy, aspiring to a scientific standing, inflicts the same fate on the life of the mind, which is laid out on the Procrustean bed of formal or symbolic logic. Non-analytic philosophy, heavily influenced by Martin Heidegger and existentialism, is enthralled with death. Technology implements prevalent scientific and philosophical perspectives on a planetary scale, seeding death everywhere. Nature, then, is accessible to our understanding as an a priori lifeless sum total or aggregate of natural things, something that I've already mentioned. The default condition of our thinking, if not of our being, is a death cleansed of life, the death which nonetheless passes for life itself, plus the cutting-edge research on how to delay aging and to satisfy the ever-growing demand for immortality, for the ultra-rich, of course, for the ultra-rich. And this is one of the topics of post-humanism, right? The overcoming of death, but of course, for those who can afford to pay for it. Now, as Ishita pointed out, the original articulation of nature as birthing not only feminizes the figure or the figuration of nature, but also zeroes in on a phase of life conventionally identified as its beginning. And so we will talk now a little bit about this notion of the beginning, but before that, I want to draw your attention to this idea of a figure or figuration of something. And in my philosophy in general, I would say that throughout my career in philosophy, I've worked with figures of thought or thought images, from plants to fire, from dust to the dump, and now the phoenix. And I think that the notion of figuration that puts us also in close proximity to myth is indispensable for the very task of thinking. Because if we try to diagnose what is going wrong, what is wrong with much of contemporary philosophy, especially in the analytic vein, it is precisely that thought has been rendered too abstract, dis or unfigured, right? And when it is rendered so abstract, then thinking itself stops, and all you can do is maybe calculate algorithms, algorithmic relations, and so on, that I myself would not consider to be the work of thinking per se. So thinking for me is only possible in connection to figures of thought, to figurations, and those figures obviously are not just a pantheon of images that are static, but what I'm interested in is the movement of figuration, and disfiguration, and reconfiguration of those figures. And the phoenix, of course, is an important character in this chain of figures that I work with. But yes, so nature becomes figured through the notion of the phoenix and figured in the feminine, even though, as we will see in our, when we look closer at the mythical character of the phoenix, the gendering of the phoenix is far from certain. There is an essential ambiguity and uncertainty that makes the phoenix male, female, or maybe sexless even as well, and maybe all of those things at the same time, but we'll get to that point relatively soon. So if we're talking about birth or birthing, we are getting to a phase of life that is conventionally identified as the beginning. The beginning that is birth is nonetheless highly peculiar. It's a strange beginning. It coincides with the moment of coming to appearance, of emerging into the light, while leaving in the shadows life's covert development, incubation, or gestation that have been unfolding prior to that moment, right? So the question of where beginning begins and where beginning ends is a very tricky one. And as we will see, that maybe understanding nature's birth or birthing is understanding it as a constant, as beginning to begin, and as constant re-beginning. And again, running a little bit ahead of ourselves, the tragedy of our current predicament is that this re-beginning is facing an objective end, perhaps, given what the global environment can actually bear in terms of its pollution and its decimation and the impoverishment of biodiversity. So while the ideology of of a kind of rich beginning that keeps beginning new every time is still operative in our minds and in our unconscious, the actual objective conditions of possibility for that rebeginning are no longer assured. And this is the rift, this is the contradiction, which serves as a starting point for our thinking of nature as a phoenix, right? So again, birth as a beginning is a very peculiar one here, and the end of a life and death is a counterpart to its beginning at birth. But unlike the coming to appearance at or in the beginning, death is not a disappearance, right? So birth as a beginning of life is simply a moment of appearing out in the world, right? Even though life was ongoing in its covert stage. Death, which is a counterpart to birth, is not a disappearance. The dead body, the corpse, remains, and moreover, these remains themselves undergo further changes, decomposing and later on becoming compost for the germination and nourishment of new life. The past participle form of nascere, which yields natura, starts making sense in the first place, not in the light in which those born make their appearance, but in the darkness whence they emerge and whither they recede, right? So this nascere, this coming to light at birth, makes sense only in terms of the darkness, of the obscurity from which this coming to light becomes possible and to which it then returns. And in fact, we will see that this is one of the refrains in Bhagavad Gita, the idea that beginnings are obscure, ends are equally obscure, only the middle is visible, right? This goes back to our previous seminar, lingering in the middle with plants, right? So only the middle is what presents itself to us. And even the point that seems to be the origin or the beginning is obviously a midpoint for another process that had been unfolding until then. Yes, so nature then, in terms of nascere, starts making sense not in the light in which those who are born appear, but in the darkness whence they emerge and whither they recede. The overall birthing that is nature does not exclude either dying or the dead, without whom the future-oriented trajectory of birth would not have been possible, right? So it is not a life-affirming kind of view at the expense of death, but rather death and dying has to be understood as necessary conditions of possibility, material conditions of possibility for life and its continuation, right? One of the difficulties today, here I'm referring back to my earlier work in dump philosophy, is what I diagnose as the death of death. So here I was talking to you a little bit about the inflation of death by all kinds of technological, philosophical, ideological means nowadays. But if we look closely at it, then what we're facing is a kind of death, whereby the remnants, the remains that are left of bodies, of human industries or technobodies that we have created are not fecund. These are not the remains that decompose and give rise through their decomposition to future life. But precisely these remains of our technobodies, like plastics, like nuclear materials that are resistant to decomposition, are preventing what I'm calling planetary metabolisms from unfolding as they should. And so there is a death of death in the sense in which things are simply frozen, congealed in the state in which they are, the plastics that break down into microplastics but take 500 years at least to decompose actually, right? So things are congealed in the this ideal state of their identity, and thereby embody in the material world the ideals of old Western metaphysics, the ideals that are unchangeable, that are immune to the passage of time, but when they are brought out into the world, they become the absolute environmental nightmares. These dreams of Western metaphysics become the absolute environmental nightmares. I see yes, Ishito on Gaia and autopoiesis, and Mstislav, who wrote that to add to what was said about analytic tradition in the context of the seminar, Mstislav thought that the reason for the absence of such a thing as analytic philosophy of nature is its ahistoricism. Yes, I absolutely agree with you that there cannot be an analytic philosophy of nature precisely because we need a certain notion of synthesis, which is missing from analytic philosophy by definition, right? Analytic philosophy can only break things down into their component parts. And this is its claim to scientificity. But we also need the synthetic moment to think and to be and to live. And this synthetic moment is absent from analytic philosophy in that sense, definitely. Now, although at the subterranean level of being, death is not opposed to birth, the two moments have been treated as the extremes of a life, its end and beginning points, death and birth as the end and the beginning of a life. But at the same time, and I think this point is quite interesting, death looms as the other of life itself. It is the only notion I know of that participates in two binary relations at the same time, death versus birth, death versus life, right? So death is the only notion that at least I know of, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, you know of another one, that can participate in two binary relations at the same time. Death versus birth, death versus life. If death is the contrary of a beginning of life and of life as a whole, is that because life is always at its beginning, which is also an insurpassable middle, born or reborn from itself as much as from its other. While saluting Hannah Arendt for the important work she undertook in this respect, in respect of natality, we have no choice but to admit that natality is still poorly understood. Through an appreciation of its relation to life and to death, we might get a little closer to deciphering some of the meanings of nature that we are concerned with in our seminar. Now, of course, the thinking of nature does not begin with natura, which privileged the coming to appearance at birth. If we go a little bit further, then in ancient Greece, it started with the pre-Socratic notion of physis. Let me write it for you as well here. Physis, sometimes you can spell it like this, sometimes like this. Sorry. Physis and physis with the Y or with the U. So physis, that undeniably more vegetal than animal, meant, and I quote here from one of the scholars of ancient Greek thought, not only that out of which things grew, or of which in the last instance they are constituted, physis included the law or process of growth exemplified in all things, right? So physis as nature is understood as the overall growth, the overall growing of everything. It is a noun that is obtained from the verb phuin, to grow or to appear. And it is the same verb that gives rise to the Greek word for plant, phyton, understood as a growing being. Phyton, understood as a growing being, but it has also many other meanings, such as child, descendant, or creature even. And so taken together, the growing, that out of which, and that toward which things grow amounts to physis, to nature in the ancient Greek sense. And by the way, this rule of thumb that I mentioned a little bit earlier, that in ancient thought, a microcosm already reflects the macrocosm, and the macrocosm can be understood on the basis of a microcosm, is very beautiful. This thesis is very beautifully exemplified with regard to physis and phyton, with regard to nature and plant. So if nature, for ancient Greeks, is the whole that grows, the growing whole, and the plant is a growing being, then in the miniature, a plant as a growing being contains the dynamics of nature as such. And nature as such, in its enormous dimension, can be understood as a gigantic plant, growing, decaying, metamorphosing plant, right? So this is the double mirroring effect of micro and macro realities exemplified very clearly with regard to nature and plant here. And this means that the ground of growth is not substantively different from the growing. It is made up of the traces of past growth decayed into the soil they fertilize, right? And that's where death becomes fecund. There is a certain fecundity, life-giving character to death, which we can understand obviously with regard to decomposition and compost and the enrichment of the soil, but which in the ancient world and all the way to the 17th century, more precisely all the way to 1666, when Italian physician Francesco Redi debunked this theory. This fecundity of death was understood in terms of the spontaneous generation, the theory of spontaneous generation, which meant that dead decomposing flesh gave rise to new life. So if you noticed worms that were appearing, small worms or other bugs and flies that were appearing on rotting meat, for instance, or rotting flesh, then for the ancients and all the way to 1666, this would be understood as small creatures that are born out of this, this dead flesh. So death as an incubator of life in this sense, right, was an important point to keep in mind. Nor is physis an ever-expanding polymorphous extension, but a swelling and contracting circle. So the notion of growth itself has to be rethought and readjusted to what it actually means, because for us it has been really tainted by highly modern and capitalist notion of growth as a quantitative extension. Right? But growth, if we look at a growing plant or growing anything, is never just a quantitative extension. It is always a cycle or a rhythm of growing and contraction, and growing out of contraction and contracting from growing, right? So the qualitative aspects of growth and its very intimate relation to what seems to be its opposite, contraction, are very much included in the notion of physis as a growing whole. It is not a polymorphous extension, but a swelling and contracting circle, a kind of rhythm, a breathing rhythm almost of cosmos, of the cosmic soul, right? This kind of movement of swelling and contracting. Growing, coming to appearance, living, these are all rooted in death, which is why all life is an afterlife. All growth is an aftergrowth. Self-grounded physis or nature is radically ungrounded, abyssal, right? So it's an abyss precisely because of the self-grounding. There is nothing else that grounds physis. Its thinking cannot be outmoded because what it holds in store and what it invariably withholds from us is always yet to come. So this is my main point, my takeaway message for today's inaugural session of the seminar. The idea of nature, the thinking of nature in particular, can never be outmoded. It is not an archaic term that needs to be abandoned. The thinking of nature is always yet to come. It is a future. Nature comes to us from the future, not from the past. This is only a presentation of the thesis, which we will deepen a little bit more in what follows. But I want us all to keep this in the backs of our minds as we are seriously discussing the notion of nature as a viable concept in the 21st century, without necessarily conjugating it with culture and using this composites nature, culture, nature, and all of the other excuses that we need to come up with in order to legitimately refer to nature nowadays. No, I want to inspire the thinking of nature that would be future oriented and would come to us from the future, as opposed to being a kind of piece of unwanted luggage we haul from the past. Any questions or comments on this, please? So I suggested we take just yes.
I just had a really mundane question that I was trying to work my way through. When we talk about nature, say in the context of this seminar, I was wondering if are we part of the nature that we are talking about and trying to think through? Are we within it? Are we outside of it thinking about it? Or are we thinking with it? And is that a relevant question to even have? I was just wondering.
Yes, it's definitely a very relevant question. I think you're absolutely right that we have to clarify this. Obviously, I'm not excluding the human being from what is called nature here. And that is why the phoenix complex and the figure of the phoenix that stands in for nature is applicable to what I call the nature outside and the so-called human nature as well. But this is not to say that within the figure called human, there is not a mutation in relation to the naturality of ourselves, in relation specifically to nature as an activity of birth and birthing. And so in many of the sessions of our seminar, we will consider how it is that this birthing and self-birthing and the rebirth of the human, specifically of the human as human, has been thought throughout the history of philosophy, both in Western traditions and outside of these traditions. I have already given you a hint about the specificity of thinking the birthing activity of the human with regard to the second birth that is always idealized by philosophers, at least in the Western fold, from Plato to Hannah Arendt, right?
Yeah.
But we will also, for instance, with the notion of reincarnation in Hindu traditions, how the human can be understood as a link in the chain of these different reincarnations, why and under what circumstances a reincarnation in another human form would be possible. It would be rather exceptional in that sense. And to what extent the desire to put an end to this chain of reincarnations, to be liberated from the cycle of samsara, is maybe a specifically human idea, more human than Western thinkers would allow, who tend to dismiss it as a kind of nihilist view. So in 19th century German thought, insofar as it engages with the Hindu traditions, these kinds of dreams of dropping out of the cycles of reincarnation were usually dismissed with the disclaimer that these are nihilistic thoughts, right? A kind of preference given for nothing over being, right? And that the West is...
also, so strangely, I began to think about how in the human performativity, this what you call the breathing rhythm of the cosmic soul, right? This swelling and contracting. Within human performances, we don't sort of have that as a model of growth in a sense of human nature. And I was the cycles of reincarnation where, you know, you are either more human or less human with every birth, almost becomes, one can think of that as that kind of a cycle or as that kind of a rhythm, where there's a contraction of what it means to be human or not. And also anecdotally, the idea of the second birth. So the Brahmin as a figure, right? Another name for the Brahmin that is also, it's also the upper caste within the society, the uppermost caste and the place of most privilege where knowledge production is concerned. But another word for Brahmin is also Dvij. I'll just type it up here, which literally means those that are born twice.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And again, so their second birth is when they receive the ritual of the Janau, which is when they are ready to both consume and impart knowledge. And I thought that was a interesting correlation with what you mentioned about, Plato's coming into light.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very interesting correlation. There's a kind of parallel structure running through here. But one of the Dwidge, yes, thank you, Ishita, for the spelling. One of the ideas that I find really fascinating, and it's such an obvious thing, but goes usually unnoticed, and this is one of the reasons behind the deep desire to abandon the cycles of rebirth and reincarnation, is that obviously, since we're talking about a process that is not unilinear or unilateral, every rebirth implies a redeath, right? And this is the term that we somehow repress when we idealize the dynamics of rebirth and reincarnation, but there is no rebirth without a redeath, and therefore without all the suffering that is associated with this movement. And so this kind of close attention paid to the obscure side, to the non-illuminated side of things, will be also very important to us with regard to the Phoenix complex itself and to the alternative traditions of the rebirth of the Phoenix that do not privilege the bright instant of incineration, the fire to which the Phoenix commits itself in order to be reborn from the ashes, the spectacular scene par excellence, but rather much slower and darker and more obscure movements of the rebirth of the Phoenix that are more attuned to the very materiality of the element, to the decomposition of the Phoenix's body from which the new Phoenix emerges. So I won't give you too many spoilers of the sessions to come, but this is one of them, right? And this is why, by the way, I argue that the Phoenix complex is a very oppressive structure that we carry within our psyches, within our unconscious, almost universally, almost in all cultures. But the only way to get out of the Phoenix complex is to move through it. So we simply cannot abandon it, just as any unconscious tendency we cannot simply cut ourselves off from it, but it has to be worked through in the psychoanalytic sense of working through and then transformed into something else. And as we will see, many of the resources for working through the Phoenix complex are already included in the rich mythical traditions and religious and philosophical traditions that engage with the figure of the Phoenix, but that have been, for one reason or another, overlooked, marginalized, and really pushed out of the intellectual sphere. So we'll be turning to many of these marginalized resources precisely in order to work through the Phoenix complex and try to transform it into something else. Yes, definitely. So I suggest that we take just a 5-minute break now to catch our breaths, and then for the rest of the session today and maybe going into the next session, we will talk a little bit about this future-oriented thrust of thinking nature and how philosophy of nature comes to us from the future and not as an archaic remnant of the past. Okay? Thank you. And I'll see you in 5 minutes.
You're taking just a 5-minute.
Okay, I think we are ready to continue. So if you could turn on your cameras, that would be great. Thank you. So just before the break, we were talking about the way in which the notion of nature, or the thinking of nature, comes to us from the future and not from the past. And if physis belongs to the future, then of course it is an enigma, because the future, by definition, not as an extension of the present, but the radical future, is enigmatic. It cannot be known as such. And it is in this sense that I'm connecting the insight that the thinking of nature comes to us from the future to the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who observed in the famous fragment 123 that nature loves to hide, right? And I will write it to you for you here in Greek, or transliterated. Physis cryptestai phile, right? Cryptestai phile. Nature loves to hide. Or translated otherwise, the way I would translate it, the growing coming to appearance has a predilection to self-encryption, to concealment and non-appearance, right? This is the paradox of, I mean, when you say nature loves to hide, okay, it's like an animal that loves to hide. But if you think about physis as the growing whole that comes to an appearance, but it has a predilection, it loves to encrypt itself, it loves not to appear. And reformulated this way, of course, the fragment shows a unity of opposites, which is a theme that winds through virtually all Heraclitean thinking. The unity of opposites, appearance and non-appearance, coincide immediately in the activity that nature pursues. Insofar as there is an order of things said to be natural, it is hidden. Its successful elucidation conflates it with the appearing growing entities themselves and therefore misses the mark. And in a similar vein, the Delphic maxim, know thyself, right? This ancient Greek maxim, know thyself, does not culminate in secure knowledge of the objective kind. Were it to have done so, it would have missed the very self to be known. Right? So we can never really reach that absolute self-knowledge, precisely because the self is nothing objective to be known. Now, the paradoxical nature of Heraclitean nature may be attributable to many different causes. For example, to the hunch that the ground for growth and for appearing does not grow, but decays and withdraws from the world of appearances and visible forms, right? So if we again correlate nature with plants, the ground, the literal ground, the soil out of which plants grow, is a realm of obscurity. And this is what all appearing and growth are rooted in. Or another possibility to consider, we might attribute the paradoxical nature of Heraclitean fragment to the fact that the coming to appearance is nowhere to be found in the sphere of what appears, right? So the appearances themselves are there, the phenomena are there, but we cannot pinpoint, we cannot identify the very coming to appearance among these appearances. But that said, what attracts me in these three Greek words that I put in our chat here is not the hiding, but the loving. It is impossible not to love this love. The love, philia, of nature, puts it on a par with philosophy. Just as nature is the love of hiding, so philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? And so a little ironically, we might call nature philocryptia, by analogy with philosophia, right? Philosophia, love of wisdom, philia of sophia, wisdom. And what Heraclitus tells us is that nature loves to hide. So its love is cryptia, right? Philocryptia. So what else can we glean from the nexus of philosophy and nature formed by philia, right? So if we're talking not only about the thinking of nature, but specifically about the philosophy of nature, then what can we say about this combination, given that they share the love of hiding on the one hand and of wisdom on the other hand? Compare the two darlings of philosophy and nature, the respective objects of their love, namely wisdom and concealment. At first glance, it seems that they are completely opposites, that they are worlds apart. Wisdom discloses reality as it is, the essence and truth of being. Concealment, on the other hand, denies us such a disclosure. But on a closer second look, we will come across a cardinal difference between knowledge, even the absolute knowledge, and wisdom. The former, that is knowledge, is pure eidetic light shed on every corner of existence. The latter, that is wisdom, is a highly elusive thing slipping from everyone's grasp, as Plato's dialogues amply demonstrate. So when it comes to wisdom, and then Plato really stages dramatically this constant escape, slipping of wisdom away from the grasp of a philosopher. And that is why this love is not an appropriation, is not a possession. It is a kind of erotic pursuit after wisdom, which never really has what it pursues within its reach. It follows that nature and philosophy share, besides love itself, the love for the fugacious, for what is difficult to track down and impossible to catch, for an object that is axiomatically absent because it is yet to come, whether it be Sophia, wisdom, or whether it be nature as a hiding, an enigma that is not available in the present. Now, fast forwarding to the 19th century, Friedrich Schelling, who echoing or resonating with the deep impulses and vibrations of deep thought was exceptionally attuned to nature as an activity, was entirely correct in his assertion, and I quote him, that to philosophize about nature means to create nature, unquote. So this is a statement by Schelling himself. To philosophize about nature means to create nature. And we should not hear even a trace of idealism in this assertion. This is not a manifesto of the social construction of nature, avant la lettre. In keeping with Schelling's logic and our own initial foray into the subject matter, nature is not created at will by the philosophers philosophizing about it. The philosopher who creates nature does not manipulate it as an object of theoretical understanding and practical construction, but joins, always belatedly, its own constitutive active force and the tradition of others who in the past endeavored to interpret this force, channeling the love of wisdom into physis that loves to hide. Right? So it is not a construction, this kind of creation of nature is not a construction at will, but a kind of belated joining its own impulse, its own vector of movement of nature that loves to hide. And so the main question of our session today is somewhat misplaced. In our hurried, half-baked judgment, philosophy of nature is a thing of the past, just as nature is a meaningful concept, is a thing of the past. Part of a naive approach, unaware of the intricate commingling of nature and culture, nature and artifice, nature and technique. We do not take either the time or the care necessary to distinguish a philosophy of nature capable once again, or for the first time, of relating to nature as such, distinguishing this philosophy of nature from natural philosophy, philosophia naturalis, which uncritically carried out the activity of natural sciences before they became independent disciplines with well-defined domains of knowledge and their corresponding methodologies. And so in light of this indistinction, it would be better for philosophers to refrain from meddling with the scientific study of nature, lest they smuggle archaic metaphysical prejudices into the rigorous knowledge production and verification procedures of the natural sciences. So only if we conflate a philosophy of nature with natural philosophy will this criticism be right. But it is necessary to gain the space and the time and the patience necessary for pursuing, reinventing, reimagining a philosophy of nature. If, on the contrary, there is anything we can learn from the fuses of the pre-Socratics, it is that no one can justifiably lay claim to and conceptually correlate, right? So nature is a kind of fuses, is a wild thing that cannot be conceptually delimited, correled, or conceptually claimed even. Nature is indomitable despite our technologically substantiated illusions of total mastery and control over it. Despite all the routines of cultivation, domestication, and manipulation, it has never been kept at bay, firmly maintained in any theoretical or practical grasp. And just in brackets, I would say that the thinking of the Anthropocene in this sense is absolutely mistaken, because it precisely takes as its point of departure the absolute domestication and control of nature, a kind of absolute permeation of what is called nature by the forces of human industry, their byproducts, and so on, without affording a certain wild kind of element to nature that does not allow it to be understood in any fixed way in this sense. Nor, by the way, has philosophy been tamed enough to be transformed into intellectual property, regardless of the drive toward systematization, right? Subjection to logical rules and procedures, methodological regulation, and so forth. And here, Schelling's assertion about nature finds a more general supplement in Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's suggestion, and I quote them, that the object of philosophy is to create concepts that are always new. Concepts are not waiting for us ready-made, like heavenly bodies. There is no heaven for concepts. They must be invented, fabricated, or rather created, end quote. Nature and philosophy participate in a synergy of creation, instigated by the wild, untamed, and untamable love at the heart of both. Let me pause here and see what feedback, comments, suggestions you have, because next, in conclusion of today's session, we will consider out of what this philosophy of nature and the meaningful concept of nature can be constructed, because obviously it does not come ex nihilo. So we will need to consider the formal, material, and historical limits for the imagining and invention and creation of the notion of nature, which is nonetheless always yet to come, always futural. So please, any comments?
So I have a question. I don't know, maybe just to slow down our progress, but we are defining nature by the human conscious. And how vast is the nature? Like how can we go beyond the notion of nature? Is it just planet Earth, or it's the next nature going to be on Mars?
Yes, yes. So what I'm trying to suggest, first of all, just by going back to the Greek and Latin etymologies of nature, is understanding nature as a verb and not as a noun, understanding it as an activity, and specifically as an activity of birthing, a perpetual birthing, which of course then does not exclude the movement of death, in which it is to a certain extent rooted also. And once we frame the issue in this way, then of course the response to this question, what about the nature of Mars and so on, will be very different, right? To the extent to which it is participating in the overall thrust of birthing. and growth, which is not to be understood as a quantitative increase of dimension, but as a cosmic rhythm, this cosmic breath that I was talking about. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is important to keep in mind that in philosophy, specifically in Western philosophy, the thinking of contra natura, the thinking of what is against nature, has not always been a rebel kind of rebellious thinking, right? So if in a very caricaturized way, we are saying nature traditionally referred to a static order of beings, a hierarchical order, then the thinking against nature, movement contra natura, would somehow break with that imposed hierarchy. That has not been the case. So I'll give you an example, for instance, from a thinker, medieval thinker like Avicenna or Ibn Sina in the Islamic tradition of philosophy. So, and Avicenna, of course, is highly influenced by Aristotle as well. But for him, there is something like the movement contra natura, the movement against nature. And that is the movement that is not in accord with the element to which it belongs. So let's say the element is the earth, and the earth is defined by its heaviness. So the movement according to the element of the earth would be heavy bodies falling down to earth, right? This would be a natural, and therefore that would be the natural movement. The movement contra natura would be the movement in the opposite direction. So a bird whose body is heavy and earthy takes flight. It moves to the element of air without falling down to earth. And this would be the movement contra natura for Avicenna or Ibn Sina. The same applies to plant growth. When the upper portion of the plant appears above the earth, when it germinates and starts growing, then this is a movement contra natura because it is a heavy earthy body that moves against the element of the earth without falling down. And for Avicenna, these are very important instances, actually. These are the justifications and the proofs of the existence of the soul. The fact that a bird and a plant are ensouled beings, and that in them, that allows them to move contra natura, is precisely their souls, right? The metaphysical entities, right? And by extension, we could say that Western metaphysics has been understood precisely as what exists and moves contra natura. Starting with Plato's ideas that do not germinate, are not born, they do not die, they never change, right? They exist forever the same in their eidetic realm. So nothing can be contra natura more than this idea of the ideas in Plato, right? It is formulated, the very tenets of the Platonic world of ideas is the exact opposite of physis and of plant processes, right? In fact, the ideas are defined, constitutively defined by the fact that they are not born, and therefore they are not natural, right? If nature is understood as the movement of birthing. And I would say that much of Western metaphysics arises from this opposition to, it does not arise from a certain fetishization of nature, it arises from an opposition to nature as an activity of birthing, right? And with its finitude of growing, decaying, and so on. Yes, Nima.
Okay, and how we can then redefine the nature by improvement of techno-humans when they do not contribute in birth, do not give anything as compost, but plastic, nuclear waste, fossil fuel and stuff like that. And also further on, like AI, that they are not contributing in birth. They have like immortality and they just participate in death part of the notion of nature. So can we redefine nature when we dismantle the life process and we just have continuous death?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it is not really excluded as a possibility. If, as I have just been arguing, nature, the notion or the idea of nature is always yet to come. It belongs to the future. This does not preclude the idea that the futurity, or one of the strands of the futurity of the idea of nature, is precisely what you're mentioning here. which is an alliance with death, but with not only with death as a downside or the adverse side of life, but with death as a freezing of all of these processes that need to proceed in order for life to continue. Something that I have called earlier on in the session, the death of death, right? The kind of implementation. So again, this would be the implementation in material existence of metaphysical ideals that were themselves formulated in a contra natura kind of tendency. So one of the futurities of nature would be the anti-nature nature that emerges, but again, understood in terms of nature as an activity of birth, birthing, and with the finitude of existence inculcated into it. Absolutely, yes.
I should just note really quickly, Michael, that we have like more 15 to 20 minutes left to the session. So
yes,
just keep that in mind.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So we can continue a little bit more just talking about the materials out of which we can create concepts today, and specifically the concept of nature, in order to try to resonate with its futurity, in order to try to imagine the futurity of this philosophy of nature, which is yet to come. As I've mentioned, creation does not happen ex nihilo. It requires the use of materials already at hand. And what we must contend with in this multi-layered creative effort that I propose we undertake in our venture into the Phoenix complex are at least three things. First, factors that in our present environmental, political, and economic conjuncture condition the creative endeavor, right? So all of the context that is both environmental, but also political and economic, that limits and gives a certain shape to this creative endeavor. Second, the selection process of the sorts of materials to be deployed and inheritances to be received. And third, a malleable form that could grow from these selected materials. And all 3 points, in fact, have to do with the limits to creation, limits that are historical, material, and formal. So I want to say very briefly in the time that remains to us, 1 or 2 things about each of these limits, because that will give you a kind of background to the endeavor that is the Phoenix complex and its attempt at reconfiguring nature today in the 21st century. The historical limits are probably the most pressing ones. And so the assertion that philosophy of nature is yet to come, to be invented, needs to be contextualized within the actual exhaustion of ecosystems, the accelerating loss of biodiversity, the elemental mutation of water, air, and soil under a massive influence of industrial byproducts released into the environment. Nature is the power of perpetual rebirth, and philosophy is the promise of a future-oriented conceptual self-recreation. Nature and philosophy as expressions of a boundless love of concealment or of wisdom. Philosophy of nature as a unique synergic crossing. All of these things must be vigilantly kept against the background of what I call finite finitude, hence of non-renewability that is being unfurled right before our eyes, ears, noses, and minds in the 21st century. So one of the prejudices inculcated even in this very open conception of nature as birth and rebirth is the idea that this movement would happen indefinitely, that it is infinite, despite the finitude of the beings who are being born, reborn, and who die feeding future growth, right? So against this, I think that we should really pay attention to what I'm calling finite finitude and the idea of non-renewability, also against various ideologies that are pushing the logic of renewable resources for our conception of energy and energy production that really does not pay enough attention to the ethical and ontological and historical problems associated with these notions of renewability and non-renewability, right? So this connects to the historical limits of our endeavor. A kind of, yes, philosophy and nature and philosophy of nature are future-oriented, but it is not just any open-ended future, because there is a historical horizon against which our thinking and our being and the being of all that is unfolds, and this historical horizon conditions what is possible and defines specifically what is impossible, which in this case is what we think will continue indefinitely, constant rebirth, right? Then we have the material limits for the creative exercise, which cannot stop at the history of Western metaphysics. Given how profoundly ingrained, if barely recognized in their original form, certain mythological figures and narratives governing our representations of and involvements with nature are, it would be unpardonable to exclude them from a nascent philosophy of nature. So precisely mythology, mythological figures, they are crucial to a nascent philosophy of nature. Considering the cross-cultural universality of the theme, it would be inexcusable also to keep to the Western tradition alone, not least because the philosophical West is a flimsy and artificial construction propped up by support beams from North Africa and Arabic-speaking worlds, among other formerly non-Western places, right? Bearing in mind the elusiveness of nature and its ontological reach, it would be also unjustifiable to restrict the scope of this work to staple themes of natural philosophy, while keeping the topics in ethics, politics, aesthetics, and so on out of the discussion, right? So this sort of philosophy of nature is not going to be limited either, materially limited, either to sources from the Western tradition alone, or to sources from philosophical discourse, ignoring literary and mythical traditions, or once again, to other domains that seem to be formally outside a philosophy of nature, such as ethics, politics, or aesthetics, right? These are the materials at hand. And I see there are two comments here from Jonathan about the fact that nature is path dependent. Yes, and in this sense, not only is nature path dependent, nature is the path or paths. And here we are sort of touching in a very preliminary way on the notion of Tao, of the Tao as the path, right? Being itself or nature itself is a path and not a destination in this sense. So path dependent in this sense that we are not talking about a destination that is somehow separate from this path itself. And from Maria Jesus, we have that the delimitation by the dimensions upon which such paths are mapped and followed. Absolutely, yes. So the path itself is not a free-flowing, free-winding kind of itinerary, but in fact, something that is conditioned by the terrain or the ground which it traverses in this sense, absolutely. And then Emil has just written that nature almost appears in the sense to be an immanent and immanent becoming. Yes, it is all of those things at the same time. But then it is not only a becoming without figure once again, because, and this I think is one of the problems of contemporary discourses and treatments of the notion of becoming, that they participate in the, what I called before, the unfiguring or disfiguring of existence. Because becoming can morph into this very abstract thing without any regard to the actual being who is becoming, or without the actual temporary forms that this becoming assumes before shedding them and assuming other forms, right? And the other idea, it's not even just the forms themselves, but the patterns, the serial patterns of becoming. So if we think about plants as beings in constant becoming, as defined by their metamorphosis, as opposed to any fixed kind of essence, then we still can identify certain phases or certain steps that this process of becoming takes from, let's say, germination, growth, flowering, fruition, and seeding, let's say, just in very general terms like this. But here, the vegetal process of becoming, and the plant is all of those things. A plant is defined by its movement and passage from a seedling to something that produces flowers, flowering, fruiting, seeding, and so on. But nonetheless, there is an identifiable pattern, and it is not, again, a free-flowing becoming. We have to, and this connects to Maria Jesus's point about the delimitation of thinking itself to the dimensions upon which these paths are mapped and followed. So it is not just the world out there that follows these patterns of becoming, and that despite the fluidity of metamorphosis has an identifiable rhythm of movement, but our thinking too, right? And much of my work in plant thinking has been trying to bring human modes of thinking to this kind of vegetal, to their vegetal roots, precisely in this rhythmic serial pattern of becoming that applies to the very materiality of our life and thought, right? Yes, and finally, the formal limits. The third point is the formal limits of our endeavor to construct a philosophy of nature for the 21st century with the help of the figure of the phoenix and its imminent overcoming. The formal limits are not those of a purely abstract discourse on nature. Rather than that, they admit as legitimate, as I've already mentioned, mythic, non-Western, and pre-modern figures, together with figuration as such, which depends on imagistic, imaginal, and imaginative thinking. What, at any rate, would be a form appropriate to a fugacious intersection of two wild loves of philosophy and of nature? How could this dynamic form be expressed in a lively, interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and at times colloquial fashion? In what sense might it spring up hylomorphically from the materials themselves? Remember, we talked about hylomorphism already, the matter giving itself its own forms. The same, once again, applies to the matter of thinking that keeps forming and reforming itself. And here I take to heart, I take literally the insight that the Cartesian division between the mind and the body does not apply. So all the processes that govern bodies and the physical world have to govern the mind as well. The processes of metamorphosis, for instance, of hylomorphism, right? All of these processes have to be applied in a non-metaphoric way to human thinking. So here we're not dealing with the distinction between, okay, it happens literally in the world and metaphorically in terms of our thinking. No, it happens literally with our thinking as well, or perhaps beyond the very outdated distinction between the literal and the metaphorical, right? So these are the guiding questions, methodic or methodological questions, if you will, of the reflections that will follow. Any concluding comments, remarks on those? In the next session, so our second session, we will delve deeply into the actual mythologies of the phoenix. I will first probably begin our second session by outlining in very broad brush strokes the idea of the phoenix complex as such, and how and why nature can be reconceived as a phoenix following these methodological guidelines that I presented today. And then we will talk about the phoenix complex insofar as it is a complex, what the complex means. We will touch upon the different myths of the phoenix that give us the resources to overcome the structure of the phoenix complex by moving within it, right? This kind of, it's not only immanent as Emil put it, nature is an immanent becoming, but in the same sense, our thinking is an immanent movement through this immanence but that allows us to move beyond what is given at hand also, right? So to move beyond the straitjacket of the Phoenix complex and to imagine a world and a mode of thinking that really respects and takes care of finite finitude without expecting that things will regerminate or regrow or regenerate necessarily after being burned to the ashes, after being destroyed, right? So I'm giving you a small hint here, right? This is the idea, and that probably appeared also in the description of our seminar, that when we treat ourselves and the world outside ourselves as the Phoenix, the idea is that we can burn the world outside, external nature, and we can burn ourselves to ashes, and everything will regerminate and regenerate once again without any harm done whatsoever, right? If, however, we keep the historical limits of the state of the environment that I referred to in mind, we see how this expectation no longer works. And it is from this unworkability of this expectation that I will want to start next week's session and see how contemporary discourses, even contemporary discourses of sustainability and renewable energy, are still enthralled with the logic of the Phoenix, with the logic of infinite finitude, that finitude can indefinitely recreate itself without taking into account ethically, politically, economically, philosophically, this notion of a finite finitude that we really have to come to terms with in the 21st century in order to think nature, to think with and through nature in the times that we're living in, right? So please, any remarks, comments? This is kind of small. Yes.
I was thinking about time, listening to some of your final comments and just trying to wonder what is the time of this nature, because also in some ways what you just said also suggests a breakdown of cyclical time, which has been otherwise quite glorified as a move away from linear time. And so the phoenix rising from its ashes is like a very clear figure of, like a very clear manifestation of cyclical time. And I was then thinking of, say, the spiral as a geometry of time, where there is most definitely a return, but it is a transformed return in that sense, where something veers off. I was thinking of Jari, and I was thinking of the Klineman, where there's a tangential transformation in the passage of the return, and therefore it arrives to us new. So then, the return is also coming from the future and not coming from the past. And I was wondering, just, like, is there one time, is there many times within this construction, creation of the nature?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, but it's a very big question as well that we'll be dealing with throughout the whole seminar. I will respond schematically because of the time constraints, but also because of the complexity involved here. So very briefly, in the dominant version of the myth of the Phoenix, where the Phoenix burns to the ashes and then is reborn identical to itself, time nearly disappears. It is, of course, death is acknowledged. So the Phoenix is not an eternal being, it's a mortal being, but one that can recreate itself in this way. And the whole gap between the two existences, the two lives of the Phoenix, is reduced to a brief flash of fire to which the old, dead, or dying body of the Phoenix is entrusted in order for the bird to be reborn again. So I'm arguing that in the predominant version of the myth, which also colors most of our views, ideal and idealizing views of the renewability of existence, time is acknowledged and erased at the same time. So there is a disavowal of time in technical, let's say, psychoanalytic terms, disavowal of time, affirming and negating it at the same time. And yet, in the lesser known versions of the myth of the phoenix, time is given its due. The process of regeneration is much slower. It allows for alternative forms to emerge, like a small worm that emerges on the dead flesh of the phoenix, then grows feathers and wings, and gradually metamorphoses into a new bird once again. So a lot of it rides on whether time is acknowledged and immediately erased in the idealist strain of the tradition, or whether time is given its due, and not only time, but matter itself as well. So we will talk about this confluence of time and matter, and the double allergy, as I call it, the double allergy to matter and to time in the metaphysical tradition, in the predominant tradition of the myth of the phoenix, and how it is that we can give their due once again to both matter and to time, even within the resources, the rich resources that the mythical traditions of the phoenix hold for us, right? And of course, another point that I have to mention in this respect is the question of sameness and difference. Is the phoenix that is reborn exactly the same, or is it other to the previous phoenix? We'll see that the answer is very ambiguous in the classical sources themselves that we'll be touching upon next week. It is ambiguous. It is a mix of both, the same yet another. Right? And what happens if you really try to always recreate the same, if your goal is, despite this movement and passage of finite existence, you say you want to preserve the same in its identity? What kind of paradoxes does it lead to? How to what extent is this a dangerous, harmful way of thinking? And to what extent can it welcome otherness in the return that you are pointing toward, Shita? Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe that was a really amazing point to end the session.
Yes.
I guess the time is up. So
Yes.
if
Thank
you
you.
want to say something to end it, Michael, but yeah, thank you everyone for an amazing first session.
Yes, thank you everyone for your attention. I'm looking forward to the rest of the sessions with you, and I'll see you next week in 1 week's time. Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.